Hello everyone, and welcome back to Retro Legends. So the first PlayStation is often remembered as a revolutionary machine. The console that brought 3D into everyone's homes, and the one that made the CD-ROM the standard. In short, the system that changed the video game industry forever. But there's a detail that, let's face it, the official narrative tends to ignore. PlayStation was not a perfect console. It was powerful, yes. It was innovative, certainly. But it was also a machine full of compromises, structural limitations, and questionable design choices, which developers had to learn to circumvent, not exploit. In this video, therefore, we will not celebrate the legend. We will analyze it. Because understanding why PlayStation won also means understanding what wasn't working. Oh, and don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell for more journeys into the world of retro gaming. Let's start. The genesis of the PlayStation is, well, less romantic than is often told. It didn't come from a long-term strategy, but from a sudden break and a decision made in a very short time. The agreement with Nintendo to create a CD player for the Super Nintendo didn't just fail due to commercial disagreements, it highlighted a deep cultural rift. Nintendo saw the CD as a risk to market control. Sony saw it as the inevitable future of media. When the agreement fell through, Sony found itself with ready technology, investments already made, and no structured alternative plan. At that point, the choice was almost forced to transform an aborted accessory into a standalone console, not out of vocation, but to avoid losing ground and industrial credibility. Sony, until that moment, had no direct experience in designing complete game consoles. It had enormous expertise in consumer electronics, optical media, and audio-video, but it lacked a consolidated vision for game design, a software ecosystem, and first-party development. And this, well, is clearly reflected in the approach adopted. More engineering-focused than game-centric, more oriented towards specifications than the overall balance of the architecture. The absolute priority became time. To get to market before Sega consolidated the Saturn's advantage, and before Nintendo could reorganize around a new CD-based strategy. In this context, many decisions were made prioritizing what was immediately achievable, not what would have been optimal in the long run. The result was a console designed to excel in a precise area, polygonal 3D, sacrificing versatility and architectural refinement. Choices such as simplified texture management, the absence of some advanced graphics functionalities, and an extremely rigid memory structure were not random errors, but deliberate compromises, dictated by the need to reduce development time and complexity. In other words, the PlayStation was not designed to be the ideal console. It was designed to work immediately, to attract developers quickly, and to establish itself as a credible alternative in an already hostile market. This reactive, almost defensive origin is the key to understanding many of its structural limitations, not flaws of ingenuity, but scars from a race against time. The PlayStation is often celebrated as the first true 3D console, but this definition is misleading if not contextualized. More than a machine designed to handle 3D in a complete and refined way, it was a console built to render polygons as quickly and simply as possible, consciously foregoing many of the refinements that would have made the image more stable and clean. The PlayStation's GPU was extremely efficient at drawing large quantities of triangles. This was its absolute strong point: high throughput, a lean pipeline, and low costs. But this efficiency came at a price. It lacked fundamental features that even then were known and used in other graphical contexts, albeit more computationally expensive. The absence of perspective correction for textures is the most obvious example. Textures were affine mapped, without taking into account their real depth in three-dimensional space. The result was an image that held up only as long as the camera remained relatively stable. As soon as rotations, inclinations, or wide surfaces viewed diagonally came into play, the textures began to deform, slide, and vibrate. It wasn't a bug, nor a programming error. It was the expected behavior of the hardware. Added to this was the absence of bilinear filtering. Each texture was displayed crudely, with sharp pixels and noticeable jaggies. In motion, this resulted in surfaces that flickered and changed appearance from one frame to the next. The limited internal precision of calculations further accentuated the problem, making even relatively simple models unstable. These flaws didn't go unnoticed by developers. On the contrary, they profoundly influenced how games were designed. Many visual solutions, remembered today as stylistic choices, were actually damage control strategies. Artificial fog served to conceal texture popping and distortion in the distance. Dark environments reduced visual contrast, making distortions less noticeable. Paradoxically, low-resolution textures, by deforming less, proved more stable than detailed ones. In this sense, the aesthetic of the first PlayStation didn't stem from a coherent artistic vision, but from a series of forced adaptations. The 3D was there. It was fast. It was impressive for its time, but it was also fragile. Every game had to constantly negotiate with the hardware's limitations, find compromises, choose what to show and what to hide. The result is that flickering and imperfect image remembered with nostalgia today. But at the time, it wasn't an iconic trait. It was simply the price to pay for being first. One of the least discussed, but most critical limitations of the PlayStation was its memory. 2 megabytes of main RAM, an extremely low value, even for the mid-90s. This fact, more than any graphical or stylistic choice, defined what was possible to do on the machine, and what was not. The RAM was the real bottleneck of the entire system. Every element that had to be present in real time, polygonal models, textures, animations, game data, portions of audio, had to fit into that tiny space. There was no margin. Every kilobyte counted. This forced developers into an extremely selective design process. They didn't load what would have been nice to have, but only what was strictly necessary at that precise moment. Textures, for example, had to be small, repeated, and aggressively reused. Seemingly different environments often shared the same assets, recolored or slightly modified. Levels were divided into rigid sections, designed to fit comfortably in memory without overloading it. Even animations suffered. Few frames, short cycles, broken movements. Not by artistic choice, but because loading smoother animations would have simply saturated the RAM. Audio was another significant compromise. The PlayStation could handle good quality sounds, but only in limited quantities. Many effects were aggressively compressed, or continuously loaded and unloaded during gameplay. Music often consisted of short loops, or tracks played directly from the CD to avoid occupying precious memory. And this is where the CD-ROM comes into play. On paper, the optical disc offered enormous space compared to cartridges. In practice, however, it was slow. Very slow. The CD allowed large amounts of data to be stored, but not to be accessed quickly. This created a clear divide between what was potentially available and what could actually be used during gameplay. The result was frequent and structural loadings, not occasional ones. Endless elevators, slowly opening doors, Narrow and winding corridors, sudden black screens, these weren't narrative or stylistic solutions but technical expedients. They served to buy time to clear the RAM and reload it with data from the next section. The world promised by the CD as limitless was actually fragmented into separate blocks, invisible to the player only thanks to these tricks. Each area was a watertight compartment. Each transition, a technical necessity disguised as design. This did not make the PlayStation a failure, quite the opposite. But it defined its character. A seemingly powerful hardware, but constantly forced to contend with insufficient memory. A console that could display ambitious three-dimensional worlds, but only on condition of breaking them up, compressing them, and hiding their seams. The PlayStation is often celebrated for its iconic soundtracks, and rightly so. But behind that musical richness wasn't technical abundance, it was compromise. Audio on PlayStation wasn't the result of a generous system, but rather a delicate balance between theoretical possibilities and concrete limitations. The console didn't use dedicated sound chips like many previous machines, but a system based on compressed audio samples and, when possible, on direct streaming from the CD-ROM. This approach opened up new possibilities: higher quality music, voice tracks, more cinematic atmospheres, but it also introduced structural problems. Every sound loaded into RAM took up space from something else. Models, textures, animations. Audio was never free. The sound samples therefore had to be heavily compressed. This led to highly variable quality from game to game. Some titles focused on clean music but drastically reduced the number of simultaneous effects. Others prioritized the sonic impact of the action, sacrificing musical complexity. Rarely could you have everything at once. Streaming from CD, often used for main music tracks, avoided occupying RAM, but it introduced a new conflict. The optical drive couldn't do too many things at once. If the game needed to load data, the music had to stop or be managed with extreme caution. In many productions, during loading screens, the music would stop or disappear entirely. Not by artistic choice, but because the system couldn't handle both operations. This also influenced sound design. Music tended to be short, easily restartable loops. Dynamic tracks, which changed based on the action, were rare and complex to implement. Even audio spatiality was limited. The number of simultaneous channels was finite, and exceeding it meant losing sounds or introducing distortions. In many games, the priority was clear. Gameplay came first. When memory or CD bandwidth was under pressure, audio took a back seat. Cut effects, lowered music, sudden silences. Not because audio was considered less important, but because it was the most expendable component to keep the game responsive. The paradox is that precisely these limitations contributed to making many soundtracks memorable. Essential compositions, strong melodies, targeted arrangements. The PlayStation allowed for great sonic expressiveness. Yes, but only for those who knew how to work within rigid constraints. Every note we hear today as iconic is the result of a choice, often of a sacrifice. Another often forgotten limitation of the PlayStation concerns how players physically interacted with 3D. The original controller was, in fact, a direct evolution of the Super Nintendo pad. A digital directional cross, 4 front buttons, no analog sticks, no physical feedback. It was a perfect tool for 2D and adequate for a still theoretical idea of three-dimensionality, but not for free and continuous 3D. This created an immediate rift between ambition and reality. Games offered three-dimensional worlds, but the player explored them with binary inputs. Either you press or you don't press. No speed modulation, no subtlety in movements. Walking, running, rotating the view became a sequence of jerks, not a natural flow. The problem wasn't the developer's talent, but the lack of an adequate tool. Only later did Sony realize its mistake. First with the dual analog, then with the DualShock, came analog sticks and vibration. But the damage, in part, was already done. Much of the PlayStation catalog had been designed around the directional pad, and introducing analog meant rethinking entire control systems. Many games added it as a secondary option, not as a design foundation. This led to hybrid and often clumsy solutions. Characters that spun on themselves instead of steering smoothly. Cameras controlled with unnatural button combinations. Sudden accelerations, difficulty in metering movements, imprecise combat. The 3D was there, but the player's body was not yet aligned with that space. The paradox is that PlayStation pushed very hard on the three-dimensional imaginary, but forced the public to learn a new control language without providing them with the right tools. Only towards the end of the generation, with games designed natively for analog, did movement begin to become fluid, intuitive, natural. Until then, 3D on PlayStation was more of a conceptual conquest than an ergonomic one. The world was three-dimensional, but the player's hands were not. Another structural limitation of the PlayStation becomes evident when analyzing cameras, collisions, and the perception of space. Elements that we take for granted today, but which were not codified at all in the mid-90s. The problem wasn't just the hardware's power or the scarcity of memory. There was a lack of a common language for representing and controlling three-dimensional environments. Cameras, in particular, were the most fragile point. In many games, they weren't intelligent entities, but simple viewpoints anchored to the character or rigid scripts. This led to shots getting stuck in environments, sudden angle changes, and loss of visibility at critical moments. The player wasn't just fighting against enemies, but also against the eye observing the scene. Collisions suffered from a similar problem. The 3D models were often approximate, built with invisible volumes that didn't perfectly coincide with what was seen on screen. Hitting an invisible wall, falling from an apparently solid platform, or missing a jump by a few pixels was not an uncommon feeling. The discrepancy between visual space and logical space broke the illusion of the 3D world. Even more critical was the management of depth. Without stable visual references, without reliable dynamic shadows, and with low resolutions, estimating distances and heights became more an exercise in memory than perception. Many games required learning to feel the space, not to read it. After dozens of attempts, the player understood where to jump, not because it was clear, but because they had already failed enough times. All of this didn't stem from carelessness, but from an experimental context. Developers were literally inventing 3D as they were producing it. There were no best practices, manuals, or shared standards. Each studio tried different solutions: fixed, semi-dynamic, or completely free cameras, simplified or extremely complex collisions, rotation-based or absolute direction controls. Some intuitions worked, others didn't. The result was a generation full of brilliant ideas, but also continuous friction. The promise of total freedom in 3D clashed with a reality made of compromises, attempts, and invisible limits. The PlayStation didn't offer boundless worlds. It offered new, still unstable worlds, where every step forward was conquered through error. And that's precisely the key point. The myth of perfection emerges later. At the time, 3D on PlayStation wasn't a destination, but a journey. Chaotic, fascinating, and profoundly imperfect. Sony's editorial strategy was one of the decisive levers of PlayStation's success, but also one of its deepest contradictions. Unlike Nintendo, which had built its dominance on strict control of the supply chain, Sony deliberately chose the opposite path, lowering entry barriers and letting the market regulate itself. CD-ROMs were cheap to produce, didn't require high minimum orders, and drastically reduced risk for publishers. Licenses were less restrictive, approval times were faster, and creative restrictions were much lighter. For any developer, big or small, PlayStation became the easiest platform to publish on. This attracted an enormous number of studios, many of whom were experiencing 3D or large-scale productions for the first time. The result was a vast catalog, new genres, experimental hybrids, games that would have never found a place on other consoles. Niche JRPGs, survival horror, rhythm games, bizarre titles difficult to classify. PlayStation became a fertile ground for experimentation. But the same openness that allowed gems to emerge also lowered the minimum quality bar. Without rigorous filtering, the market quickly filled with mediocre, rushed, or technically fragile products. Games published to seize the moment, to occupy shelf space, to ride fleeting trends. Titles with interesting ideas but weak execution, or blatant clones of other successes, lacking polish. For the consumer, discerning real value became increasingly difficult. Nintendo had used control as a tool to protect the platform's identity. Sony, on the other hand, accepted chaos as the price of expansion. It didn't seek a coherent catalog, but one dominant in volume and presence. PlayStation had to be everywhere, offer something to everyone, even at the cost of diluting average quality. This choice had lasting consequences. On one hand, it fueled the perception of PlayStation as a free, adult, unpredictable console. On the other hand, it solidified the idea of an unbalanced ecosystem, where absolute masterpieces coexisted with forgettable products, often just inches apart on the same shelf. Creative freedom was real, but it wasn't free. Sony won the market war also because it agreed to lose control of the details. And that loss, while generating variety and innovation, also left obvious scars in the historical memory of its first console. The image of PlayStation as an easy platform for developers is largely a retrospective construction. In the early years, the reality was much tougher. Sony was entering the console market for the first time, and despite its enormous engineering expertise, it didn't yet have the necessary experience to effectively support a large and diverse development community. The initial technical documentation was fragmentary, often incomplete. Many hardware functions were not clearly explained. Others were updated on the fly, forcing teams to work on specifications that changed during development. This led to improvised solutions, poorly optimized code, and a strong reliance on direct experience rather than official guidelines. The development tools also left much to be desired. The initial kits were unstable, not very user-friendly, and required in-depth knowledge of the architecture to be truly utilized. Debugging in particular was a critical point. Identifying errors related to memory, CD streaming, or audio-video synchronization was slow and frustrating. Many bugs only emerged in advanced stages, when the margin for intervention was already reduced. These difficulties inevitably reflected in the first generation of titles. Ambitious yet technically fragile games, inconsistent performance, poorly managed loading times, obvious compromises. Not for lack of talent, but because the very ground was unstable. Developers were learning the machine while trying to build something competitive on it. Over time, Sony drastically improved support. More mature tools, more reliable libraries, more direct communication with teams. But that early period left a clear mark. The PlayStation did not succeed because it was easy to tame. It succeeded because it offered opportunities that no other platform provided at that time. The commercial success of the PlayStation was real, measurable, and historic, but it needs to be understood carefully. Sony didn't win just because it had a powerful machine or a rich catalog. It won because it captivated an audience that, until then, had remained on the fringes of the console market. The aggressive communication, the mature aesthetic, the visual language close to club culture, electronic music, and cinema made PlayStation a desirable object even for those who had never identified with the Nintendo or Sega imagery. In Europe, its dominance was clear. The competitive price, widespread distribution, and strong presence in general stores transformed the console into a mass-market product. In Japan, despite a more cautious start, the support of local developers and the explosion of JRPGs made the platform central. But the real coup was winning over the adult audience. Students, young professionals, people who no longer wanted to feel like kids while playing. PlayStation offered tougher, more complex, more ambiguous content. It was a console that didn't apologize for existing. This triumph had a powerful side effect. It rewrote historical narrative. In hindsight, many technical limitations were reinterpreted as artistic choices. The texture flickering became atmosphere. The fog, a stylistic element. The rigid animations, an aesthetic hallmark of the era. Success transformed compromises into identity, problems into nostalgia. But the market doesn't reward perfection. It rewards timing, the right offer at the right time, the ability to understand the audience better than competitors. PlayStation won because it knew how to occupy a space that others had underestimated, not because it was flawless. On the contrary, it was precisely by coexisting with those limitations that it defined an era. Understanding the limitations of the PlayStation means getting to the heart of the video game revolution. Because behind that first leap into 3D, there weren't just sharp polygons, shimmering textures, and backgrounds that broke apart in the distance. There was a new idea of what a video game could be. An idea so ambitious that the technology of the time couldn't yet fully support it. And that's precisely where everything becomes interesting. When we look at PS1 graphics today and they seem strange, unstable, almost primitive, we are actually observing the exact moment when the future of 3D was decided. PlayStation didn't change the world because it was flawless. It changed it because it dared, accepting enormous compromises. Its flaws don't diminish its value. They make it more human, more interesting, more real. And it's precisely by looking beyond the myth that we can truly understand why that console marked an era. And with this, our journey into the past concludes. How many of these fun facts did you already know? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell for more journeys into the world of retro gaming. Thanks for watching Retro Legends, and we'll see you in the next video. Stay retro, stay legends.